Have you ever felt like the world forgot you existed? That sensation of being utterly alone, where each breath feels heavier than the last, and the silence in your room at night becomes its own kind of companion. I see you there, holding yourself together with nothing but willpower and quiet tears. But what if I told you that sometimes our deepest wounds become the map to our greatest treasures? That the very emptiness carving hollows inside your chest might one day be filled with connections you never imagined possible? This is a story about finding family in the echoes of loss, about a girl who discovered that even the most abandoned places can hold the secrets to belonging. Sarah Matthews had perfected the art of being invisible by her 18th birthday. The skill had been developing since she was 8 years old, when her parents died in a crash that left her body intact but shattered everything else. 10 years of shuttling between foster homes had taught her to pack light, speak less, and expect nothing. The social workers always used the same apologetic tone when they moved her, explaining how circumstances had changed, how the family couldn't accommodate her anymore, how they'd found somewhere better. Sarah had stopped believing in better around foster home number 4. Now, standing in the county clerk's office, clutching a letter that had arrived at her latest temporary residence, she wondered if this was some elaborate joke. The letter stated that she had inherited property from a relative she'd never heard of, a great-grandfather named William Matthews, who had died 6 months earlier. According to the documents, he had specifically named her in his will, leaving her a farmhouse and surrounding acreage in rural Montana for the symbolic price of $1. Sarah had no memory of any family beyond her parents, who had rarely spoken about their relatives. The social workers had told her there was no extended family to take her in, which was why she entered the foster system in the first place. But here was tangible proof that she hadn't been completely alone in the world, at least not biologically. The county clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, slid the property deed across the desk. "Just sign here, dear. Once you pay the $1, the property is legally yours." Sarah hesitated, her pen hovering above the signature line. This could be her escape from the system that was about to age her out anyway, a chance to have something that belonged to her, something no one could take away. But it also meant traveling to a place she'd never been to claim an inheritance from a man she'd never known. I wonder where you're listening to this story from right now, maybe from your own quiet corner of the world, seeking connection through these words we share. If this story resonates with you, I'd love for you to like and subscribe to our channel, to join our community of those who understand that the deepest stories are the ones that echo in our own hearts. Sarah signed the deed, placed a crumpled dollar bill on the counter, and within days had packed her few belongings into a backpack. The bus ride to Montana was long, giving her too much time to second-guess herself. What if the property was uninhabitable? What if this was all an administrative error that would be cruelly corrected upon her arrival? By the time she stepped off the bus in the small town of Pinewood, her expectations had dwindled to almost nothing. The town was tiny, the kind of place where Main Street actually deserved its name, because it was practically the only street of significance. Sarah got directions to the Matthews property from a friendly shopkeeper who seemed surprised to hear the name. Old Bill's place? Hasn't been anyone living out there for years, not since he moved into assisted living in Billings. You family? The casual question caught her off guard. Family? Was she? Technically, yes, but the connection felt hollow, a biological fact without emotional substance. "He was my great-grandfather," she replied, the words strange in her mouth. "I didn't know him." The shopkeeper's expression softened with something like sympathy. "Well, it's about 3 miles down County Road 22. Can't miss it. Big red barn with a faded roof. House needs work, but the land's good." Sarah thanked her and began walking. It was April, and the Montana spring brought a chill that cut through her thin jacket. The landscape was different from anywhere she'd lived before. Vast open spaces between modest houses, mountains in the distance, and so much sky it almost hurt to look up. County Road 22 was mostly dirt, and Sarah's shoes were covered in dust by the time she saw the property. Even from a distance, she could tell the shopkeeper had been generous in her assessment. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Several windows were boarded up, and the garden was a tangle of weeds and overgrowth. The big red barn stood about 50 yards from the house. Its paint faded to a dull rust color, but it appeared structurally sounder than the house itself. A rusted mailbox at the entrance to the dirt driveway confirmed she was in the right place. Matthews was barely legible on its side. Sarah stood at the property line for a long moment, clutching the keys the county clerk had given her. This was hers now. All of it. The broken, abandoned place matched how she felt inside so perfectly that she almost laughed. Of course, this would be her inheritance. Not some surprise fortune or welcoming family home, but a dilapidated farm requiring more care than anyone had ever given Sarah herself. She walked up the overgrown path to the house, climbed the steps carefully to avoid the places where the wood had rotted, and unlocked the front door. The interior smelled of dust and disuse, but beneath that was something else, a faint scent of wood polish and pipe tobacco. Sarah moved through the room slowly, taking inventory. The furniture was old, but solid, covered in sheets that had protected it from the worst of the dust. The kitchen had ancient appliances, but when she turned the faucet, rusty water spluttered out, indicating that at least some utilities were still connected. Upstairs, she found 3 bedrooms. One was clearly the master, with a sturdy oak bed frame and matching dresser. Another seemed to have been used for storage, boxes stacked along the walls. The third caught her attention. Unlike the other rooms, this one showed signs of having been occupied more recently. The twin bed was made up with a faded quilt, and a desk in the corner held stacks of notebooks and papers. On the wall hung a corkboard with yellowed newspaper clippings and photographs. Sarah moved closer to examine them. Most of the clippings were about local farming news or weather patterns from decades ago, but the photos made her breath catch. One showed a young couple standing in front of the farmhouse when it was newly painted and well-maintained. The man had his arm around the woman, who held a baby. Sarah carefully removed the thumbtack and turned the photo over. Written in faded blue ink were the words "John and Mary with baby Ellen, 1962. Ellen. Her grandmother's name had been Ellen. Sarah had few memories of her, as she had died when Sarah was only 5, but she remembered her father speaking of his mother with great affection. Could these be her grandparents and her father as a baby? She returned to the corkboard, scanning the other photos with new interest. There were pictures of a young boy growing up on the farm, riding horses, helping with harvests, standing proudly next to various 4-H projects. In later photos, she recognized the boy as a young man who looked remarkably like her father. Further searching in the desk drawers revealed school reports, childhood drawings, and eventually, letters. Dozens of them, tied with twine and arranged by date. The most recent bundle was labeled John's Letters, 1995-2002. With trembling hands, Sarah untied the bundle. These were letters from her father to his grandfather, the man who had left her this farm. She read through them slowly, learning more about her father through his own words than she had known in the 8 years she'd had with him. He wrote about college, meeting Sarah's mother, their wedding, and eventually Sarah's birth. The letters became less frequent after she was born, but each one mentioned her with obvious pride and affection. The last letter was dated just months before her parents' accident. Sarah wiped tears from her face, realizing that her great-grandfather had known about her all along. But why hadn't he come for her after the accident? Why had she been told there was no family to take her? The answer came the next morning when Sarah ventured out to explore the barn. Unlike the house, the barn had been maintained better, though it clearly hadn't been used for livestock in many years. The main floor was mostly empty, except for some old farm equipment pushed against the walls. A ladder led to a hayloft, which Sarah climbed cautiously. The loft had been converted into a sort of office space, with a desk, filing cabinets, and bookshelves. On the desk sat a typewriter with a sheet of paper still in it, as if the writer had stepped away momentarily rather than permanently. Sarah approached the desk, noticing a thick folder labeled with her name. Inside were documents that told a story her social workers had never shared. William Matthews, age 72 when Sarah was orphaned, had filed for custody immediately after learning of the accident. His petition was denied due to his age and health conditions. He had early-stage Parkinson's disease and lived alone in a rural area without adequate services for a child. He appealed the decision repeatedly for years, even offering to move closer to town, but was denied each time. What the folder also contained were copies of letters he had written to various foster homes and agencies, inquiring about Sarah's well-being. Most had been returned unopened or with form responses citing privacy regulations. A few had handwritten notes from social workers explaining that they couldn't legally share information about Sarah without her guardian's permission. The final document in the folder was his will, updated just a year before his death, leaving everything to Sarah with a handwritten note that read simply, "I tried to find you. I hope this helps you find your way home." Sarah sank to the floor of the hayloft, the folder clutched to her chest. She had never been truly alone. Someone had been fighting for her, thinking of her, trying to reach her all these years. The knowledge broke something open inside her, a door she had sealed shut after being disappointed too many times. Further exploration of the loft revealed more treasures: family photo albums dating back generations, journals kept by her great-grandfather describing life on the farm, and eventually a large metal lockbox hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The box was heavy, and Sarah had to use all her strength to pull it out. It was locked, but a small key taped to the bottom of the desk drawer fit perfectly. Inside, Sarah found stacks of cash, savings her great-grandfather had apparently kept outside of banks, along with several small jewelry boxes containing heirloom pieces. At the very bottom was another envelope with her name on it. This one contained a detailed letter explaining that he had been saving this money for her education, along with bank account information for a college fund he had established in her name years ago. The letter ended with coordinates and a cryptic instruction. "The real treasure isn't what's in this box. Look beneath the north corner fence post where the creek bends." The next day, armed with a borrowed compass from the house and the coordinates from the letter, Sarah made her way to the northern edge of the property, where a small creek wound through a stand of cottonwood trees. The fence post at the coordinates was distinguished by a small carving of a bird near its base. Sarah dug carefully around it, eventually unearthing a waterproof container. Inside was a journal with her grandmother Ellen's name inscribed on the first page. The journal chronicled Ellen's life from her teenage years through her marriage and early motherhood. It revealed a family history Sarah had never known: how her grandmother had left the farm against her father's wishes to marry John, how they had reconciled years later when Sarah's father was born, and most surprisingly, how her grandmother had been a gifted storyteller who had published several children's books under a pen name. The journal ended with a passage written in a different hand, her great-grandfather's, dated just months before his death. "Ellen always said stories were how we keep people alive after they're gone. I've kept all your parents' stories for you, Sarah. Now it's your turn to continue the story." Over the following weeks, Sarah began the enormous task of bringing the farm back to life, much as the farm was bringing her back to life. She used some of the money from the lockbox to hire local help for the major repairs to the house, but she tackled many projects herself, learning as she went from books in the town library and tutorials on the public library's computers. She planted a small vegetable garden in what had once been her grandmother's herb patch. She cleared out the overgrown flower beds around the porch, uncovering perennials that had somehow survived years of neglect and now stretched toward the sun with remarkable resilience. The work was hard and constant, but for the first time Sarah felt rooted. The property was hers in a way nothing had ever been before, and each improvement she made strengthened her connection to it. She began meeting people in town as she made regular trips for supplies. Unlike in the foster homes, where she had always felt like an unwelcome guest, the townspeople accepted her presence without question. She was William Matthews' great-granddaughter, returned to restore the old family place. It gave her an identity, a history, a context she had never had before. 3 months after her arrival, while clearing debris from a collapsed shed behind the barn, Sarah found a small metal box containing dozens of envelopes. Each was addressed to her at various foster homes, but none had been mailed. Inside were birthday cards, Christmas greetings, and short notes about life on the farm. Her great-grandfather had written to her faithfully for 10 years, even without knowing if he had the correct address or if she would ever receive his messages. Each card contained a $10 bill or small gift certificate, modest presents from a man of modest means who had never forgotten her. One evening, as summer faded toward fall, Sarah sat on the newly repaired porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors she was still getting used to. She held her grandmother's journal in her lap, rereading favorite passages and thinking about the generations that had lived on this land before her. The sense of connection had grown stronger as she'd learned more about her family, not just the basic facts of their lives, but the richness of their personalities, revealed through letters, journals, and stories shared by older residents in town who remembered them. Her great-grandfather had been known for his integrity and quiet generosity. Her grandmother had been creative and a bit rebellious. Her father had been the smart one who left for college, but always came back to visit. These details filled in the outline of her family tree, giving it substance and meaning. Sarah had begun writing in a journal of her own, recording her experiences and thoughts as she restored the farm. Sometimes she wrote letters to her great-grandfather, telling him about her progress and how she was using his gift. She never mailed these, of course, but the act of writing to him felt right somehow, a continuation of the correspondence he had tried to maintain with her. She had also started visiting the local nursing home, where he had spent his final years, bringing flowers for the staff who had cared for him and listening to stories from residents who had known him. Through these conversations, she learned that he had never stopped talking about her, proudly showing anyone who would listen the few school photos he had managed to obtain through persistent requests to various agencies. He had told everyone that his great-granddaughter would come to the farm someday, that he was keeping it ready for her. By late fall, the house was weather-tight and comfortable, if not fully restored. Sarah had converted the third bedroom, the one that had contained her father's childhood possessions, into a study where she spent evenings reading through family papers and organizing the scattered pieces of her history. One rainy afternoon, she discovered a hidden compartment in the back of her father's old desk. Inside was a small leather pouch containing a tarnished silver locket. When she managed to open it, she found tiny photos of her parents on their wedding day. A note tucked into the pouch explained that this had been her grandmother Ellen's locket, passed to her father to give to Sarah on her 16th birthday. The accident had happened before he could fulfill this plan. Sarah fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it against her skin like a physical connection to the past. That night, she dreamed of a family dinner with faces she recognized from photographs sitting around the farmhouse table, passing dishes and laughing together. She woke with tears on her face but a sense of peace in her heart. As winter settled over the farm, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into something pristine and quiet, Sarah began to think about the future. The money her great-grandfather had saved, combined with the college fund he had established, meant she could afford to take classes at the community college in the nearest large town. She enrolled for the spring semester, choosing courses that would help her manage the farm more effectively, along with literature classes that connected to her newfound appreciation for storytelling. She also began researching her grandmother's published works, eventually locating copies of 3 children's books written under the pen name E.M. Johnson. The stories featured a young girl having adventures on a farm, very much like the Matthews place, finding magic and meaning in everyday rural life. Sarah recognized elements of the farm in the detailed descriptions, the way light filtered through the cottonwoods by the creek, the particular creak of the third step on the porch stairs, the view of distant mountains from the upstairs windows. Reading these books, she felt as though her grandmother was speaking directly to her across time, sharing the love she had felt for this place. On the anniversary of her arrival at the farm, Sarah invited neighbors and townspeople who had helped her throughout the year for a small gathering. She served food on her grandmother's dishes, using recipes found in a handwritten cookbook in the kitchen cupboards. As she looked around at the people filling the once-empty house with conversation and laughter, she realized that she had found not just a home, but a community. She belonged here in a way she had never belonged anywhere else. Late that night, after everyone had gone, Sarah sat at her great-grandfather's desk in the barn loft and began to write a story of her own. It began with a girl who thought she was alone in the world, discovering an abandoned farm, and it expanded to include all she had learned about family, belonging, history, and hope. She wrote about how the past is never truly lost if we know where to look for it, how connections can stretch across time and distance, unbroken even when we don't recognize them. She wrote about the small treasures hidden in forgotten places, not just physical objects, but memories, stories, and love that had been waiting for her to claim them. As she typed the final words on her great-grandfather's old typewriter, Sarah understood what he had meant in his last journal entry. The real inheritance wasn't the farm or the money he had saved. It was the story, her family's story, now continued through her. And for the first time since she was 8 years old, Sarah Matthews felt complete, no longer an orphan, but the latest chapter in a narrative that had been unfolding on this land for generations. She belonged not just to this place, but to a lineage of people who had loved the land and each other, who had experienced joy and loss, who had planted seeds, knowing they might not see the harvest. In continuing their story, she honored them. In making the farm her home, she had found her way back to herself. The next morning, Sarah walked to the family cemetery plot at the edge of the property. It was a small, peaceful area beneath a large oak tree where generations of Matthews' family members had been laid to rest. Her great-grandfather's grave was the newest, the earth still settling after the winter. Sarah knelt beside it, placing a small stone she had found by the creek on top of the headstone, a tradition she had read about in one of his journals. "Thank you," she whispered, running her fingers over the engraved name. "I'm home now." As she walked back toward the farmhouse, the rising sun cast her shadow long across the fields her family had tended for generations. The broken places inside her hadn't disappeared, but they had begun to heal, patched together with threads of connection to a past she had never known she had, and a future she was now free to imagine. The farm, once abandoned, was coming alive again under her care, just as she was coming alive within its boundaries. Sarah had arrived with nothing but a backpack and a dollar bill spent on inheritance. She had found so much more, not just property and possessions, but purpose, identity, and the profound knowledge that she had never been truly forgotten or unwanted. Her great-grandfather's secret hadn't been hidden in the barn all along. It had been his unwavering belief that family transcends time, distance, and even death. The real secret was that love persists, that belonging is our birthright, and that sometimes the places that seem most abandoned hold the greatest capacity for renewal. As Sarah reached the porch steps, she paused to look back at the property stretching before her, the repaired barn, the tended fields, the creek catching morning light. This was her inheritance, not just the land itself, but the story it contained. And as she turned to enter the house that now truly felt like home, Sarah knew that her own story was just beginning, rooted in this place but reaching toward a future full of possibilities she was finally ready to embrace.